Hi, and welcome to my channel. Here, you'll discover some of the most incredible events in history. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss anything, leave a like in advance, and enjoy the story. This story began with statements about freedom, democracy, and help. That's how it was explained. It ended with millions of deaths, a ruined country, and crimes that still make people look away. The United States entered Vietnam claiming to fight communism, but for the Vietnamese, it wasn't about ideology. It was a fight for independence. When American bombs started falling on villages and soldiers fired on civilians, it became clear that this wasn't a mission to protect peace. It was another form of foreign control. But the roots of this war went deeper. Long before American involvement, in 1858, France invaded Vietnam. The goal was described the same way, to bring civilization. Roads were built, bridges, administrative buildings. French officials said they were turning savages into people. But the Vietnamese saw them as occupiers, like the Chinese before them. The resistance began, and with it the idea of independence, an idea that would stay alive for decades. In 1919, after World War I, American President Woodrow Wilson spoke publicly about national self-determination. Inspired by this, a young Vietnamese man, later known as Ho Chi Minh, tried to hand him a petition calling for Vietnam's independence. It was signed by Vietnamese nationalists. Wilson never responded. Ho Chi Minh had left Vietnam in 1911. In exile, he saw France, the Soviet Union, and other parts of the world. He became a communist, but remained a nationalist. His goal was the same: independence. When Japan invaded Indochina during World War II, Ho returned and in 1941 created the Viet Minh, a guerrilla force fighting Japanese occupation. They attacked from the jungle, struck quickly, then disappeared. The same tactics they would later use against the Americans. At that time, the U.S. was looking for allies against Japan. Through the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the CIA, American intelligence made contact with Ho. They supplied the Viet Minh with weapons. American soldiers trained them. Ho called his group the Viet American Army and praised the U.S. publicly. He believed that after the war, America would support Vietnam's independence. He was wrong. On September 2, 1945, the day Japan surrendered, Ho Chi Minh stood in Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi and declared Vietnam's independence. The crowd celebrated. For a moment, it seemed like the country had a future. But in Washington, Roosevelt was gone. Truman was in power. And in Europe, the Cold War was starting. France didn't want to lose its colonies. The U.S. supported the French government. The war resumed, now against the same fighters the Americans had armed earlier. In 1950, North Korea invaded the South. The U.S. responded. The Korean War began. A new theory appeared in Washington, the domino theory. If one country fell to communism, others would follow. Vietnam became part of that logic, not because of strategy, but because of fear and pride. In reality, the Vietnamese were fighting for something else entirely, not communism, not ideology. They were fighting to get rid of foreign control. French or American, it made no difference.
By 1953, the French army had been fighting in Vietnam for 7 years. Backed by American money, they were losing soldiers, vehicles, territory, and morale. More than 100,000 French troops had been killed, wounded, or declared missing. Trains were bombed, convoys ambushed, and fortified bases surrounded. But in Paris, officials continued to act as if victory was only a matter of time. The turning point came at Dien Bien Phu. The French built a heavily fortified base in a valley, convinced they could control the entire region from there. But they didn't secure the surrounding hills and jungle. That mistake was fatal. The Viet Minh, nearly 50,000 strong, surrounded the base, set up artillery in the mountains, and cut it off. The French had not expected an attack from above. The battle lasted 55 days, shelling, infantry assaults, and complete isolation. When it was over, out of 11,000 French soldiers, around 8,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. France surrendered. Its colonial presence in Indochina was over. In 1954, the Geneva Accords were signed. Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. In the north, Ho Chi Minh and the Communists. In the south, a pro-American government led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Under the agreement, national elections were supposed to take place within 2 years to reunify the country, but Diem refused to allow the vote. He was a Catholic president in a majority Buddhist country, and he had U.S. support. He knew he would lose. Most of the population supported Ho. This marked the beginning of the second phase of the war. Ho Chi Minh did not abandon the goal of reunification. He began building a supply route through Laos and Cambodia. It would become known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Weapons, fighters, and supplies moved south. A new guerrilla war began. The U.S. continued backing Diem's government, financially and militarily. More weapons, more advisors, more money. But inside South Vietnam, the regime was unstable. Corruption was widespread. Political repression grew. Religious tensions escalated. Diem targeted Buddhist communities. Pagodas were closed. Monks were arrested. In 1963, in the center of Saigon, a Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc set himself on fire. He sat silently in the lotus position as flames covered his body. American television crews recorded it. By then, U.S. officials knew Diem's government was collapsing, and although they had supported him for years, they began planning to remove him. In November 1963, Diem was assassinated in a military coup backed by the CIA. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy was also killed. Lyndon Johnson became president. By this point, there was no longer talk of a quick solution. The war was escalating. In 1964, an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin provided the official justification for direct U.S. military involvement. An American destroyer was allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. Whether the attack actually happened is still debated, but for the White House, it didn't matter. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It gave the president broad authority to wage war. Soon after, the U.S. began bombing North Vietnam. The campaign, known as Rolling Thunder, lasted for 3 years. Villages, roads, bridges, hospitals, and schools were bombed. Napalm and Agent Orange were used. Forests were burned. Fields were poisoned. Agent Orange caused long-term health problems across generations. Children were born without limbs, with severe deformities. Entire communities suffered from cancer, genetic damage, and environmental collapse. By 1965, the U.S. had sent 200,000 troops to Vietnam, and that was just the beginning. By 1967, there were over 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam.
Official reports spoke of progress and an approaching victory. But the situation on the ground was different. The countryside was full of traps. The Viet Cong, lightly armed and mobile, operated across most of South Vietnam's rural areas, as much as 75% by some estimates. They moved through villages, forests, and fields. The enemy could be anywhere. A weapons cache might be hidden in a rice shed. A local resident could be carrying information or supplies. American forces responded with large-scale sweeps, search and destroy missions, artillery strikes, and bombings. But none of it stopped the resistance. Then came one of the most brutal episodes of the entire war. On March 16, 1968, in the village of Son Mai, Quang Ngai Province, soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, entered the area under orders. They believed Viet Cong fighters were hiding there, but there were no fighters, only civilians, elderly residents, women, and families. Over the course of 4 hours, American troops killed at least 504 unarmed people. Many were shot at close range. Homes were burned. Some victims were beaten to death. Others were buried under rubble. The site of the attack became known to the public as My Lai. It was not a combat operation. It was a massacre. The event was concealed by command for more than a year. The truth only came out after Ron Haberla, a military photographer who had been present, released the photos he had taken. In 1969, the images were published and caused a national scandal. Despite the scale of the atrocity, only one person was convicted, Lieutenant William Calley. He was sentenced to life in prison, but released after just 3 years. No one else faced trial. My Lai was not an isolated incident. Similar operations were carried out in other parts of the country. Entire villages were destroyed. Civilians were shot from helicopters. Farmers were killed while working in their fields. Official reports described this as disruption of enemy operations. In reality, it was systematic violence. Soldiers often fired without warning. Homes were flattened. Entire families were lost. Many troops experienced psychological breakdowns. According to Pentagon estimates, 1 in 3 American servicemen suffered from serious mental health issues. Drug use was widespread. Suicides increased. Some soldiers turned against their own commanders, a phenomenon later called fragging. Still, the Pentagon continued releasing upbeat reports. One of the main metrics used to measure success was the body count, the number of enemies reported killed. Officers pressured their units to meet quotas. Civilian deaths were often misreported as enemy losses. By 1968, the number of civilian casualties had reached the millions. In Vietnam alone, more than 2 million non-combatants were killed. Tens of thousands more died in Laos and Cambodia during U.S. bombing campaigns that were never officially acknowledged. All of it was framed as part of a broader campaign for peace and democracy. But for people in Vietnam, it looked and felt like a prolonged occupation, destructive, unjustified, and impossible to defend.
After the My Lai massacre became public, support for the war began to erode inside the United States. Protests spread across the country. It wasn't just students or pacifists. Veterans, working-class Americans, and parents of fallen soldiers were on the streets.
Many no longer believed the war had anything to do with freedom or democracy. Television footage showed burned villages, injured civilians, and destroyed homes. The idea that the United States was there to help was becoming harder to justify. In January 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched the Tet Offensive. On the night of the Vietnamese New Year, coordinated attacks were carried out across dozens of towns and cities, including Saigon. For the first time, Americans saw footage of battles near the U.S. Embassy, gunfire on city streets, and fighting in areas the government had called secure. Although the offensive was eventually repelled, the psychological effect was severe. For many Americans, it proved that the war wasn't close to being won and may never be. President Lyndon Johnson, shaken by the public response, announced he would not run for re-election. But his successor, Richard Nixon, did not end the war. He expanded it. Under the policy known as Vietnamization, Nixon promised to reduce the number of U.S. troops and hand more responsibility to the South Vietnamese Army. But in practice, American airstrikes increased. In 1969, a secret bombing campaign began in Cambodia, a neutral country. U.S. officials believed Viet Cong supply routes ran through its territory. These bombings were not officially declared and had no clear military goals. Civilian areas were hit. Villages were destroyed. In Laos alone, over 2 million tons of bombs were dropped, more than the total dropped on Germany and Japan during World War II. Chemical defoliants, including Agent Orange, were also used heavily. Crops died. Forests disappeared. The long-term effects were severe. Children were born with deformities. Rates of cancer and illness rose sharply. Entire communities were affected for generations. At the same time, new information continued to emerge about military operations inside Vietnam. One example was Operation Speedy Express in the Mekong Delta, carried out from late 1968 to mid-1969. Official reports claimed more than 10,000 enemy fighters were killed, with few American casualties. But later investigations, including a report by Newsweek, found that many of the dead were civilians. Some were shot from the air without warning. One pilot later said, "We were told to shoot anything that moved." For many soldiers, the psychological impact was lasting. Some fired without thinking. Others destroyed entire villages in reaction to attacks or suspicion. The lines between combat and murder became blurred. According to internal military estimates, a large portion of U.S. troops were affected by mental health issues. Drug abuse was widespread. Some soldiers turned their anger on their own officers. These incidents became known as fragging, deliberate attacks on commanding personnel. Despite everything, the war continued. Political leaders feared the consequences of a defeat. Nixon began peace negotiations, but at the same time escalated bombing to pressure the North into concessions. In December 1972, he ordered what became known as the Christmas bombings, a concentrated air campaign targeting Hanoi and Haiphong. In just 12 days, the U.S. dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs. Residential neighborhoods, schools, and hospitals were hit. More than 1,600 civilians were killed. The campaign was officially described as a peace effort, but for many, it looked like an act of force designed to send a message. When Saigon fell, the United States didn't just lose its position in South Vietnam. It lost the last of its claims to a mission of rescue or liberation. For many Vietnamese, it was the start of a new nightmare. Hundreds of thousands of people who had worked with or supported the Americans were arrested and sent to so-called re-education camps. Officially, these camps were for ideological correction. In reality, they were prisons. People were beaten, starved and forced to work under harsh conditions. Some died. Others spent years living in fear and poverty. Cemeteries belonging to the South Vietnamese army were destroyed or sealed. Graves were exhumed. Symbols of the old government were removed. The map was changed, but so was the physical landscape. South Vietnam was not only dismantled as a political entity, it was erased from view. Thousands of families tried to escape. This led to a wave of refugees known as the boat people, those who fled the country on improvised vessels. Many drowned in the South China Sea. Others were robbed or attacked by pirates, but more than 1 million made it out. Around 400,000 eventually found refuge in the United States. Meanwhile, the United States was dealing with a different crisis, one that played out at home. Veterans returned to a country that didn't welcome them. There were no parades, no recognition. Instead, there was silence, discomfort, and sometimes outright hostility. For many, they had become a symbol of a war the country wanted to forget. Thousands of those who returned suffered from post-traumatic stress, but there was no real system of support, no formal treatment. Help came slowly, years too late for many. Some died from addiction, others from suicide. A generation returned not just physically injured, but mentally broken. At the same time, more evidence began to surface, showing that many of the worst incidents during the war had been known and concealed. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers were published. Leaked by defense analyst Daniel Ellsberg, the documents revealed that multiple U.S. administrations had misled the public. The war had been considered unwinnable long before the Tet Offensive, but the leadership, Johnson, Nixon, McNamara, continued anyway, not for military reasons, but to protect political standing, election campaigns, and public image. Millions died because no one wanted to admit failure. The Vietnam War exposed how the system operated. In Washington, officials focused on numbers. In the Pentagon, bureaucrats managed a war like a spreadsheet. In the field, officers aimed for promotions. Civilian life, both American and Vietnamese, was often treated as secondary. Decades later, when the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan began, veterans and journalists drew parallels. Once again, the conflicts started with promises of freedom and stability, and once again, they led to chaos, violence, and widespread abuse. In Iraq, at Abu Ghraib prison, American soldiers tortured detainees, humiliated them, and filmed it. Officials said they hadn't known. Investigations were launched. A few were punished, but most walked free. The methods hadn't changed, neither had the structure that enabled them. Those responsible for carrying out the violence were rarely held to account, just as in Vietnam. Only the names and geography had changed. The logic remained the same. The United States, a country that had defeated fascism and promoted human rights around the world, had repeated the same abuses it once condemned. The war in Vietnam wasn't just a military failure, it was a political and moral breakdown, a loss of credibility, a removal of the mask. And even now, decades later, the images remain: burned villages, destroyed temples, wounded civilians, broken soldiers. The real cost of war isn't just measured in casualties. It's measured in what a country becomes when lies turn into policy. After the American withdrawal and the fall of Saigon, Vietnam was left in ruins. A country that had endured more than 30 years of colonial rule and nearly 20 years of total war had been destroyed from the ground up. More than 2 million civilians were killed. Tens of millions more were left injured, displaced, or orphaned. The land was poisoned. In some areas, the soil remained unusable for decades due to chemical contamination, especially from Agent Orange. Even 50 years later, children were still being born with genetic defects. This wasn't just a crime against a nation, it was a crime against the future. The economy was gone. Infrastructure didn't exist. Fields were mined. Water sources were contaminated. The United States imposed sanctions on a country already in collapse and ignored repeated calls for help. Diplomatic relations were only restored in 1995, and only in the early 2000s did the U.S. begin to acknowledge, partially, the consequences of its chemical warfare. But millions of people never received compensation. For the United States, the war ended with withdrawal. For Vietnam, it marked the beginning of survival. America left in failure, but presented it as a strategic conclusion. The myth of heroism continued. Hollywood turned the war into a genre, but in those films, the focus was always the American soldier, his pain, his trauma, his story. Vietnamese people appeared only in the background, without names, without voices, without the right to truth. The perpetrators became the victims were written out. The worst crime of the war wasn't just the violence or the destruction, it was the lie. A calculated, systemic lie that ran through the entire structure. The government lied to the public. Military leaders lied to their soldiers. Press officers lied to reporters. Every report was edited. Every victory was invented. Every death was explained away. Even as the situation collapsed, as hundreds died each day, the Pentagon released statements saying progress was being made, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. That's how wars like this work. They don't begin suddenly. They grow from arrogance, fear, and profit. Every missile, every bullet, every command is a product of a system where the cost is always paid by someone else. Generals get stars, boys get coffins. After Vietnam, the U.S. said, never again. But then came Grenada, then Panama, then Iraq, then Yugoslavia, then Afghanistan, then Iraq again. And with them came the same words, the same airstrikes, the same talk of precision, the same claims of liberation. The language changed, the map changed, but the pattern stayed the same. We are right. They're dangerous. The world will be better once half their country is gone. Always under the same slogans: democracy, freedom, resistance to tyranny. But underneath those words is always the same smell of burned flesh, of screaming children, of blood on the ground that no one ever cleans up. Vietnam has not forgotten, and it has not forgiven. There is no statute of limitations on destroyed childhoods, on parents buried in bomb craters, on generations of orphans and amputees. There is no dollar amount that can repay a scorched life. There is no explanation except one: never again. But as new conflicts appear on the map, as special forces enter villages under the same slogans, as children once again hide under beds from helicopters, and as politicians draw up new front lines in their offices, we are still in Vietnam. Because Vietnam is not a place, it's a diagnosis, systemic, chronic, and incurable. An empire convinced of its own righteousness will always find another country and start over, always in the name of peace.